You're listening to West Texas Talk. I'm your host, Caroline Halter. Tonight we're speaking with director, writer, and actor Johnny Stallings. Johnny will be performing Walt Whitman's Song of Myself on Friday, September 22nd at the Presidio County Courthouse lawn in Marfa at 7 p.m. He'll also be teaching a workshop focused on Song of Myself on Saturday, September 23rd at the USO building from 10:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. This event is presented by Marfa Live Arts. Johnny, welcome to our program.
Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by asking you to just describe Whitman's Song of Myself for people who aren't familiar with this work.
Yeah, when you hear 19th century poetry, you prepare yourself for a nap, but Whitman's Song of Myself is very different. It's an unusual poem. There's no other poem in any language that is like it, and none of Whitman's other poems are like it. It was an inspired utterance, and Harold Bloom, the great literary critic, says that what Shakespeare was to the Renaissance, Whitman was to 19th century American literature.
When was the first time that you read or heard Song of Myself?
Well, around the age of 18 or 19, shortly after I was out of high school.
And can you tell me the personal impact it had on your life?
Yeah, well, it has had a big impact on my life. And I think I was talking with somebody yesterday in Portland who was recalling, he's even older than me, and he recalled the first time he read the poem, and that it amazed him and seemed to open up into big vistas. And my experience was similar. I think a lot of people have that experience with the poem.
When I read it, it reminded me of some of the mystic poetry I read from several of the world's great religions. He talks a lot about himself, but also kind of transcending the self.
He has a very cosmic vision of what it means, who he is and who we are. There are many astonishing lines in the poem, but that's a very perceptive on your part. I consider it to be that, a part of the world's treasure of what might be called mystical literature or inspired spiritual poetry. It's studied in English classes, but it could be studied in comparative religion classes along with the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching, I think. Whitman says crazy things. He says, "Before I was born out of my mother, generations guided me. My embryo has never been torpid. Nothing could overlay it. For it, the nebula cohered to an orb." So that's a bold statement. He says, "In all people I see myself, none more, and not one a barleycorn less." He says, "Why should I wish to see God better than this day? I see something of God each hour of the 24, and each moment then. In the faces of men and women I see God, and in my own face in the glass." So that last little bit is very Whitmanian. He doesn't leave himself out.
Yeah, he kind of had a persona in his poetry. Is that correct?
Well, in English, among literary critics, there's much discussion of the voice that Whitman has taken for this poem. One very thrilling thing about the poem is that it's in the first person. And he often says, "I this, I that, I see this, I feel this, I do that." But also he addresses it to the listener. "Listener up there, what have you to confide to me? Talk honestly." And this was very unusual to do that, to speak directly to you. And he does it over and over again.
I think any writer has kind of a persona that they take on, especially when they're speaking from the first person. And so it's kind of interesting in this poem, he seems to have that persona, but then he's also talking about erasing the boundaries between him and other people and seeing himself in other people, or seeing, maybe some people would call it, the divine in all the things around him, not just other people, but blades of grass, for instance.
For instance, divine's a good word. He says, "Divine am I inside and out, and I make holy whatever I touch or am touched from. The scent of these armpits aroma finer than prayer, this head more than churches, Bibles, and all the creeds. But as for his persona, the me or the I that he refers to in the poem is sometimes just Walt Whitman, the man, a rough person, a person who loves to be outdoors and hang around with people who work outdoors. He talks about his own body quite a lot and about taking his clothes off. But also, so there is him, the guy, but there's also what he calls the me, myself. It's like something that witnesses everything. And in mystical traditions, that you might say consciousness is that within which everything arises and to which everything returns. And, in Indian Vedanta philosophy and in other traditions, the idea is to become one with that, to realize that your story about who you are is a fiction. Your name, the place you went to high school and all that. That's all just the story that you tell when people ask, who you are and what your job is. But in the great traditions, there's this other idea that who you are is deeper than that, is bigger than that, is vast, and maybe it's not other than what some people call God.
So for people who are just tuning in, we're speaking with director, writer, and actor Johnny Stallings, who was brought to Marfa by Marfa Live Arts. He'll be performing Song of Myself by Walt Whitman at the Presidio County Courthouse in Marfa on Friday at 7, and the following day he'll be doing a workshop.
So you asked me a little while ago about what its impact was on me kind of for my life, this poem.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm going to be talking about in the workshop and exploring with people is that this poem belongs to everybody, and Walt Whitman can become your best friend. And back to the point that it's written in the first person, the way to read this poem is to read it aloud, and as you read it, to mean it and feel it the way actors do, and even believe it. So when he says, I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars, and a mouse is miracle enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. You could go, well, Walt Whitman thinks that a leaf of grass is like the movement of the stars. Or you could just believe it, just say, I believe it. I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. And when you do that, and when you feel it, it's true. It's true in that moment for you. And if you do that enough, it actually changes the way that you perceive the world, the way that you experience it, and the way that you feel about it.
So is that what you'll be asking people to do in the workshop?
Yeah, in the workshop, it's not a big lecture. It's more that we'll be reading the poem with each other, taking turns. And after we read these sections, we'll explore some of the ideas, and people will respond to them when he says, I know I am deathless. What does he mean? He says, has anyone supposed it lucky to be born? I hasten to inform him or her it is just as lucky to die, and I know it. How does he know it? What's he mean?
So I wanted to turn the conversation to something that you've been quoted saying. You called Walt Whitman the poet of American democracy. Can you explain that?
Democracy is one of the foundational ideas of our country, and traces its origin back to the Athenian experiment around the time of Socrates. And of course, it's not the only thread in our tapestry. There are other forces at work besides democratic ones. But one of the big ideas about America is that everybody is equal. Nobody is better than anybody else. And the European idea that there are lords, like Lord this and Lord that, and you're supposed to take off your hat and all that. William Penn was a Quaker his father was an admiral, and his father said to him, well, he was still in England, he said, son, at least you could take your hat off to the king or to me, your father. He says, no way. And he was put in prison, and eventually they wanted to just get rid of him as a troublemaker, so they gave him Pennsylvania. So that worked out okay. But this idea that nobody is better than anybody else, that we're all the same, but in Whitman's sense, all beautiful, all wonderful, all amazing. But his democracy is so radical that, as you pointed out, it includes leaves of grass. Like he says, to glance with an eye or show a bean in its pod confounds the learning of all times. He says, I find I incorporate nice, coal, long-threaded moss, fruits, grains, esculent roots, and am stuccoed with quadrupeds and birds all over. So it's a funny image. He's walking around with like minerals and plants and animals like plastered all over him. But he's conveying the feeling that every particle of creation, everything that lives, is perfect, is divine, is beautiful, and people too, without exception. That's one of the things. He makes a big point. He says, I will have no person slighted or left away. The kept woman, sponger, thief are hereby invited. There shall be no difference between them and the rest.
Do you think that that notion of equality or radical equality is forgotten? Do you think that this work is more relevant today than it has been in previous decades?
You know, I think that thing of nobody's better than me goes pretty deep in the American psyche. And the people who are a little bit more mature can also go, and I'm not better than anyone else. They can realize that as well. But that's a kind of common wisdom here. I think what threatens democracy is not that feeling that people have that, for example, their elected officials aren't better than them or superior to them. I think we might have more of a plutocracy right now going than a democracy. That is, the people who represent us, especially on the national level, I mean, the citizenry votes for them, but once they're elected, they seem to be representing the interests of large corporations, basically. So
I was reading the background, the politics that were happening when Whitman first published this, which was in 1855, and the country was fighting over slavery, on the brink of civil war. There was widespread unemployment, so it was not a very united political culture. And I think today we also have deep divisions that...
Well, one of the funny things that we tend to do is think that people are different just because they have different ideas in their heads. That's kind of a superficial way of understanding each other. And I think Whitman then and now went a lot deeper than that. And we all can do that too. People who have different views than us, of course, are just like us. They just have different stories.
Yeah, or different life experiences.
Absolutely,
perhaps.
Of course.
So you obviously have this work memorized, but I'm curious if there's a particular section of it or a particular line that you love the most.
Well, I have several favorites, I suppose. I like the one where he says, this minute that comes to me over the past decillions, there is no better than it and now.
Why do you like that?
Well, it follows from an earlier thought. He says, I'm not the poet of goodness only. I do not decline to be the poet of wickedness also. What blurt is this about virtue and about vice? Evil propels me, and reform of evil propels me. I stand indifferent. My gate is no fault-finder's or rejecter's gate. I moisten the roots of all that has grown. Did you guess the celestial laws had yet to be worked over and rectified? This minute that comes to me over the past decillions, there is no better than it and now. I kind of like that, his idea, like, do you think you can improve the universe?
Like, that's a laughable idea.
Lao Tzu, has a similar observation in the Tao Te Ching, that people who try to improve the world make it worse.
Do you think that's true?
Well, it depends on, what the context is.
But maybe it's a lesson in humility. that we're small
Yeah,
compared to
maybe something like
the wider world.
Well, for Whitman, we're both large and we're small. One of the things he says is that the feelings that men and women have for each other are a summit and flower, and they are to branch boundlessly out of that lesson until it becomes omnific, and until one and all shall delight us, and we them.
So what if somebody in a workshop, for example, has trouble understanding the poem? What do you do?
Well, the poem is not a complicated poem. I mean, it's not one of those ones like T.S. Eliot's Wasteland or something that you need an English professor by your side to, unpack it. It's pretty clear. I think the poem could put some people off. It's not everyone loves it with the immediacy that I do. And I think one of the things that people are taken aback by is the egotism. He says, I know perfectly well my own egotism and know my omnivorous lines and must not write any less. And then he adds, and would fetch you, whoever you are, flush with myself. But he specifically kind of rejects humility in one part of the poem. And we're all told that we're supposed to be humble and we're supposed to, not, put ourselves forward or make much of ourselves, and that's, bad manners. And just as we're grown, as we grow up, it's kind of drummed into us that we shouldn't talk like this. And so when some people first hear it, they are kind of shocked by it and find it off-putting.
Did you ever find it off-putting?
No, I didn't. I got right in the groove with it because I could see that he wasn't just talking about himself as a personality. He had glimpsed something big about what our true identity is, and he really invites everyone to share in that vision.
For those of you who are just joining us, we're speaking with Johnny Stallings. He was brought here by Marfa Live Arts to perform Song of Myself by Walt Whitman this Friday at the Presidio County Courthouse at 7 p.m. The following day, he'll be teaching a workshop from 10:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. at the USO building.
And it includes lunch.
Whitman talks a lot about working men and women, and he also critiques exorbitant wealth or the desire to be constantly accumulating more possessions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of his most charming statements in Song of Myself is he says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." So in his most expansive voice, he loves everyone and sees everyone the same. But just in his regular cranky personality, he did have more admiration for working class people and hardworking people who worked outdoors than he did for people who dressed in fancy clothes and put on a lot of, perfume. That was just a personal prejudice of his, I think. We all have them.
Yeah, that's true. So I had read prior to sitting down with you just what a few other scholars have written about Whitman, and some say that he really believed that poetry could keep the nation together. And so I'm wondering if you share that view. And again, It was at a time when the nation was deeply divided.
Well, I'm not familiar with that idea of his per se. I know that, like a lot of poets, he believed in the power of poetry, that it was something very important. Whitman, in his own time, the poem "Song of Myself" shocked people, and it was caused a scandal, really, a sensation. And not very many people read it, but most of the publicity was very, very negative because of its explicit sexuality. It was considered an obscene poem, and so Emily Dickinson and many other people just never touched it because they heard that it was, obscene. he just talks frankly about his own body and how much he enjoys it, among other things. So in his own time, he wrote this great work. It's a work of genius. It's now considered, by many literary critics to be the great poem of America so far. And it's had a huge impact on other poets. But in his own day, it must have been discouraging to him that nobody would even read it. And so as he went on in his life and throughout his life, he was talking to people in the future. He said, I know someday some people are going to get this. There were admirers in his own time, Mark Twain, Robert G. Ingersoll, Oscar Wilde. There were people, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who appreciated what it was and saw that it was extraordinary. One of the earliest critics said that he didn't know if it was a poem, but if it wasn't a poem, it was something greater. And I think that's perceptive. It belongs on the courthouse lawn, not just in the English classroom. I think Walt Whitman would be very happy that we're going to do it outdoors in Marfa, and that everybody's invited, and because he saw something that was true, he felt it deeply, and he expressed it beautifully, and so he wanted it to go into people and change them. And I think that this poem, very rare for a poem, but it is a poem that can actually change you. One more thing about
please.
Whitman and the poem and the Civil War. First edition was 1855, and there's a section in it where he says, "To anyone dying, thither I speed and twist the knob of the door. Turn the bedclothes towards the foot of the bed. Let the physician and the priest go home. I seize the descending man and raise him with resistless will. O despairer, here is my neck. By God, you shall not go down. I dilate you with tremendous breath." It seems like a very bold statement, and it is bold. He says, to anyone dying, I want to be there, and I will hold you, and I won't let you die, he adds later. And you go, okay, well, that's Walt Whitman showing off again. What an egomaniac. And yet, what he did during the Civil War was he spent all his days in the hospitals doing exactly that. It's prophetic. It broke his health, but it's not officially a nurse, but he worked for the YMCA, and he spent every day, all day long with dead and dying and wounded people, loving on them, writing letters for them, bringing them little packs of coffee and stuff. And so what might have seemed like a kind of outrageous statement of what he would do turns out to be actually exactly what he did do.
It seems like he was almost acting in accordance with the Bible. Some of the stories we hear about Jesus are similar to that.
Well, Harold Bloom, again, the critic, calls him a saint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see you getting a little bit emotional over that. Why?
Yeah.
Why
well,
is that?
I'm an emotional person, and Whitman says somewhere in the poem that love is the foundation of the world, and I believe that to be true. And I mean, just the image of him doing that touches me deeply.
Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Caroline. One thing before I go, I'd like to thank Marfa Live Arts and the city of Marfa for hosting me, and hope to see a lot of people next 2 days.
And if you want more information about the upcoming performance and workshop, you can visit marfalivearts.org.